I'm Jamal St here alongside Justin Barney. Justin, Jaguars been busy.
It's been an eventful offseason
Yeah.
for the Jaguars, and I know we've talked about this before on News4JAGs. We're talking about the number 1 overall pick the last couple of years.
Yeah, different
Now we're
this
talking
year.
about the number 24 overall pick, and we're not talking about who they taking at number 1, who's the quarterback, who's the prospect they're getting. Now we're talking about kind of lower down in that draft order. So it's a different kind of vibe, different kind of offseason for the Jaguars after that unexpected playoff run.
Yeah, hey, you get in the playoffs, you're not trying to reinvent the wheel now. They picked 24th, but the kind of really different feel this year is in years past you kind of had those spending sprees in free agency. This year, Jaguars didn't exactly come into the offseason with much money. Actually, They were over the salary cap, so now Trent Baalke having to do a lot of work to get them under, and then even today, a move that kind of gets them back closer to that line than they were before. So a lot of moving pieces as they try and find a way to kind of improve the roster.
Yeah, and Trent Baalke and Doug Peterson spoke this week about the NFL Combine, about what this roster is going to do. And Trent, just like he said in the offseason, his last meeting before the offseason was draft and develop. Draft and develop. We want to keep the guys on those first contracts. And when you start getting good and getting those guys paying second contracts, you're not going to be able to afford them all. And we're seeing that right now with Jawan Taylor.
Yep.
That playing out. And last year kind of really went against how you build a good football team. And that's spending to the cap last year and writing checks, unbelievable amount of checks to bring in good guys like Evan Engram, Christian Kirk. I mean, they emptied the wallet last year, and you're seeing a little bit of the residuals of that now. You're having to kind of clean that up in the restructures and what Jacksonville is projected to be well over that salary cap heading into this new league year, which starts March 15th.
Right.
They've done extremely well in creating some cap room, really just in this last about 10-day period alone.
Yeah, all right, let's start with the news of the day. Evan Engram franchise tag by the team. Evan Engram and Jawan Taylor are like the two premier free agents for the Jaguars this offseason. I mean, Arden Key is a key, and they have some other key free agents, but Evan Engram and Jawan Taylor are the two guys. Evan Engram now franchise tag by the Jaguars, and I think if you've been listening to like us or other local media outlets, everybody's been saying, look, Evan Ingram's not leaving Jacksonville. It was just never going to happen. It was either going to be an extension or it was going to be the franchise tag. As of right now, we see it's under the franchise tag, but like I kind of been reminding people, I'm like, just remember, Cam Robinson was franchise tag last year and then never actually played on the tag because they just used that to buy more time to work out an extension. So even though Evan Engram is tagged right now on that 1-year deal, that doesn't mean that he ends up actually playing on the tag.
Right, and it really just buys the Jaguars some time. March 15th, there are a couple of big dates that we're approaching. March 15th, start of the new league year, which means free agent deals can become official and things of that nature as the new league year kicks off. 2023 starts on March 15th for the NFL. You can negotiate before that with those free agents. Not going to be a lot of negotiations with Jags this year. Like last year, it was an absolute avalanche of guys signing with the Jacksonville Jaguars early on in free agency. Not going to have that this year just for the free agency pitfalls. Again, we saw that spending free last year. We're not seeing it this year, and Trent Baalke has said as much. So don't get used to that, Jaguars fans, as far as what we saw last year. The other side of that for the Evan Engram argument, July 15th, 17th range is what we're looking at because those franchise and transition tag players have until July 15th, 16th, 17th to make that official if they're going to sign to a new agreement with their team. So for Evan Engram, it's those two big dates. I think I think Evan Engram, the Jags will get a deal done.
Oh yeah.
Although I'm a little hesitant on this because Evan Ingram's had one good season. It was a prove-it deal for him.
Sure.
I'd like to see a little bit more from Evan Engram. So I don't necessarily think the franchise tag is a bad thing at all. He still gets a raise. Obviously, he doesn't get that longevity that a lot of players want with those new deals. Franchise tag is just for one season, and it pays him the average of the top 5 highest in the league, and that's a little over $11 million. So that's a little bit of a bump for him.
Well, you got to keep in mind the Jaguars wanted to do a multi-year deal with him last offseason. Evan did not want the multi-year deal. So the Jaguars had confidence in Evan's ability and how he would fit in Jacksonville when they brought him in. They wanted to sign him to a multi-year deal. Evans and his agent said, no, we want the 1-year prove-it deal. The Jaguars brought him in on the single-year contract, of course, and Evan came in and had the year that he expected. He bet on himself, and now it's worked out. Now, the franchise tag, would he play for the franchise tag? Probably. he probably would. But is that ideal for the Jaguars, a team that's tight on cap space right now? No. For them, it'd be better if they could space out the cap hit a little bit and try and create more cap space to do other things, because we're looking at the cap number now, and that still hasn't included Calvin Ridley, who we know is coming in at some point. So there's still a lot of moving pieces on this thing. We knew Evan Engram was going to stay in Jacksonville. It was just going to happen one way or another. I still think a multi-year deal gets done, just because the Jaguars have that incentive to create more cap space, find a way to alleviate some of the cap room pressure that they have right now, and they don't want to let him leave. You also don't want to let Jawan Taylor leave, and we've talked at length about Jawan Taylor and not letting young players leave Jacksonville before, but the hard thing is that we knew they were never going to franchise tag Jawan Taylor.
Right.
You just can't do it because it would be too much money.
Right.
I mean, for a right tackle to franchise tag him, extremely expensive. So it was just never going to happen. So it always made sense to, if the tag was used, it was going to go to Evan Engram.
And again, a smaller tag. And the benefit of the tag is tight end is not that expensive. And that's the good thing when you're talking about franchising a Cam Robinson or Jawan Taylor, that money gets up there. Tagging a tight end, that's a little bit more affordable. So Evan Engram, even though Trent Baalke said in his season-ending press conference, they did not want to use the franchise tag because, A, you don't get any salary cap relief with that. There's no way to amortize things or spread it out like you can, a signing bonus or prorate it like the Jaguars would like to do. That's a full-on about $11.5 million stamp on that salary cap. So there's no break, there's no massaging the cap anyway with the franchise tag. So he didn't want to do that, but again, it buys you that time between now and middle of July to get a longer term deal done with Evan Engram. But again, if you're Evan Engram and the Jaguars, you've got to get something done in terms of that deal by that mid-July date, because if you don't, you can't negotiate with them again until next year. So you're really, you have a little bit of a buffer. You know, this is not a kind of a Lamar Jackson situation in Baltimore. This is not that dire when you're talking about a player that eating up that much cap magnitude. You know, Lamar is going to eat up, in the $35 to $40 million range in a franchise tag. With Evan Engram, you're talking about a little over $11 million. Again, for a Jaguars team that's pinched a little bit by the cap, that's not good news. You want to get that longer-term deal done, and you can defer some of those savings until later years. But again, to me, I wanted Jawan Taylor. To me, we did this right after the season. Who was your most important guy that you got to have back? For me, it was Jawan Taylor. For you, I know it was Evan Engram. And Jawan was my 1A guy, and Evan was my 1B guy. I would like to see a little bit more from Evan Engram. Can he do this 2 years in a row with the Jaguars?
Sure.
I don't think it would be bad to let him play on the franchise tag and then revisit that next year after he's had hopefully a better year.
And he could, and very well. I mean, overall, they want to find a way to keep the core of this offense together for multiple years. I mean, especially the pass catchers for the most part around Trevor. I think Evan's just been such an important part from a leadership perspective, one of the hardest working guys in that team. Keeping him around was a must. Keeping him on the franchise tag, no, it's not the end of the world, but then you're back in square one a year from now. A guy who still is under 30, and if he does have another 1,000-yard season, does the price tag now go up? That's the risk that you run. All right, if he comes close to 1,000 yards, he rewrites what he did just this past season in Jacksonville, and now all of a sudden his camp's like, he still ain't 30. And now you don't want franchising 2 years in a row because that number goes up. So now you have to get the deal done. So that's the kind of double-edged sword of if you let him play on that tag and he goes in and has another good year, you're like, ooh, now I guess I really got to pay this guy.
Yeah, and if you tag him again, there's penalties for that. If you can't continue to tag players, and again, that goes up substantially, and the cap is going to only continue to go up. So I think it's if you're going to sign Evan to a long-term deal, you got to do it by mid-July. You've got to do it by mid-July. And if you're going to, sit on the franchise tag and see how he plays in year 2 in this Doug Peterson offense, if he goes out and blows what he did away this year, and sets his stage up for a massive pay increase next year, I don't think Jacksonville can go wrong. Evan Engram is coming back one way or another to Jacksonville. The only question is he coming back for a 1-year deal or a multi-year deal?
Yeah, that's the only question. And, ultimately, it's good that he's going to be back one way or another.
Right.
You wanted to find a way to keep him. It did sound like the sides were gaining ground just a week or two ago, like maybe there was something coming. I'm not sure what the roadblock happened that they just said, all right, you know what, we'll slap the tag on you and we'll figure it out later. But clearly something must have come up, whatever it may be. But I don't think the two sides are very far apart.
Right.
So
Evan wants to be back. I'm sure his
yes.
agent wants him to be back. Jacksonville welcomes him back. So it's probably just a matter of the signing bonus or spreading things apart or whatever. And
Probably guaranteed money's part of it for sure.
Right.
So there's some moving pieces. The guy that's always been in more jeopardy is Jawan Taylor because of the age and the position he plays and the Jaguars cap situation. When he hits the free agent market, which is now guaranteed unless they work out a long-term deal, there are going to be teams that are ready to pay up for that guy for his services.
And again, you mentioned he's a young player. Sitting his second contract in the league, and that's the big thing right there. He peaked at the absolute best time in his career. Jawan for the first 3 years of his career, a little bit of hit and miss with Jawan. There was always some issues on pass protection, holding penalties. I mean, there were some issues with Jawan early in his career, and to Jawan's credit, he cleaned everything up for this year, and he had a exceptional career year for him, and he's going to get paid. And very similar to Dawuane Smoot. If we were talking about Dawuane Smoot midseason, Jacksonville could not, projecting out, they couldn't afford to bring Dawuane Smoot back. Right. He's on the incline, young pass rusher, hitting that arc of his career, injury-free, having a great season, and then he tears his Achilles. So Dawuane Smoot was a guy, to me, that did not look like you're going to be able to afford to bring it back. Now you may be able to do that. But Jawan Taylor, on the other hand, finished the season strong, turned in a career year, injury-free, he's healthy. And I just don't think that Jacksonville is going to bring Jawan Taylor back. And the good thing about that is, and you brought this up last time, was the fact that you're drafting and you're looking ahead to with Walker Little. And again, you mentioned this when we did our mock draft a couple weeks ago. You're talking about maybe a Josh Allen replacement or somebody in this draft at that position. So you're looking ahead down the line. And Walker Little was again a guy who was an insurance policy. And again, if you pick Walker Little at right tackle, then a guard situation in this draft becomes a little bit more imperative.
Right. Now you look at guard, maybe later on in the draft or even in free agency, you look for a new swing tackle, that new backup. But those are things that you can replace. And the Jaguars are in a place that as long as they can retain a large number of their free agents, that in this draft we're going to be looking at, okay, well, what are their needs going to be next year? Who has an expiring contract? What veterans would it make sense to possibly part ways with after the season for salary cap reasons or play reasons? You're looking for free or for draft players at 24, guys that can contribute as a rookie, but in year 2, that's when you're going to lean heavily on them. That's what good teams do. You don't necessarily have to say that rookie's going to come in day 1 and instantly have to be the starter. Maybe an injury makes them have to be a bigger contributor than they were. Like if you draft a nickel corner, that's great. That's your third corner ultimately. Play a big role, still a starter in my opinion in the NFL, but not your number 1, not your number 2, not the guy. Like you don't have to say, hey, 24, you're going to go guard the other team's number 1 receiver week in and week out. So same thing like if you drafted a pass rusher. Ultimately, they're your third fiddle at pass rush. Is that basically a starter in the NFL? Yes, it is because they play a big role, but they're not your guy that you have to say is going to play down in and down out unless there's an injury. So you're looking ahead a little bit. It's projecting.
And, the last time Jackson was in this situation was after their unexpected 2017 playoff run. Again, later in the draft, you're looking at a guy who's, a supplemental piece, a guy who's going to come back in and, draft-wise and play a role.
You didn't have to.
And play a role. And, the last time they wanted, again, with Taven Bryan was a developmental guy who could kind of come in and play a role here and there and develop. And again, 2-3 years down the line, he would become that guy who you could plug in and, maybe put him in there as a starting defensive tackle. Obviously, it did not work out that way.
No, it didn't.
And Dave Caldwell, again, another colossal whiff on that draft position. But again, a guy, I look at it back, another situation like a Ronaldo Wynn for Jacksonville back in the day when they picked Ronaldo Wynn in the 20s, and he was a serviceable defensive tackle for Jacksonville. Not a standout, not a star by any stretch of the imagination, but a serviceable guy. Taven Bryan obviously did not fit that mix. And
what's funny is you bring up Taven Bryan, and these two guys are completely different players, but Brian Brzee from Clemson has a similar enough resume. Taven was considered an impeccable athlete. Brzee is an impeccable athlete. Taven did not have quite the production in college that you would think of when you think of a first-round pick. Brzee hasn't either. But Jaguars fans, a lot of them have been clamoring for Brzee, but he is a favorite. And I understand why, because if all the pieces come together, dude could be good. But he just hasn't done it in college yet. So it does still leave you kind of wondering. And given if you don't know the backstory of some of the things that have happened off the field to Brizzy, Google his name, they'll pop up. There are reasons why he might not have been focused on football. 100% acceptable reasons and understandable reasons, but neither here nor there. Over the course of his college career, he didn't produce as well. Just kind of my head put those two together, and I'm like, I don't know, because he's not my favorite guy to pick at that 24 slot as I kind of look at the draft. This week's the combine, so some of those things will change. Earlier in the week, I kind of threw out a couple of guys, and we can do that here too, that I thought the Jaguars would be keeping an eye on. Keely Ringo from Georgia.
Right.
He's right up Trent Baalke's alley. Big corner. I mean, you watch Georgia this year. That dude looks big on the field. Looks like a linebacker. He's probably going to run really fast. He's the kind of guy that Trent Baalke loves. Michael Mayer is going to be another guy. I know Jaguars fans love the tight end, and Doug Peterson loves two tight ends.
In our mock draft one, Michael Mayer was our selection.
That was his guy.
Our selection, and I've seen actually an ESPN mock this week had him going in the top 15.
Yeah,
so
he could be off the board for the Jaguars. He could be off the board very well for the Jaguars. Who else did I talk about? I said Andre Carter II. He could be a guy who should run well. He would make sense as an edge player. I think he's a projection again when you start talking about contribute a little bit as a rookie, but that next year, because he's like 6'7", and he just looks like he could put on another 20 pounds and be an impeccable player.
Right.
And he should work out really well in the combine. Who else did I have?
I can't remember who your other guy.
I don't remember. I had one more guy.
You had 4 guys in there.
But I love the combine. I've always been a draft
Alabama.
Brian Branch. Just because he's not supposed to be like a crazy athlete, but he's a very good athlete. And when you start talking, like the guys he's going to be surrounded by and in the conversation with, maybe Antonio Johnson from Texas A&M, who I like a lot, I think is going to be a good player. He's going to test really well. Branch might have like pedestrian-looking numbers compared to some of the other people. Like Keely Ringo, Branch isn't going to keep up with him.
Right.
So when you start adding in those numbers, how much is that going to impact his stock? Could we see a guy like Keely Ringo raising up those draft boards, Antonio Johnson raising up those draft boards, which in turn maybe that lowers down Brian Branch a little bit. Maybe a Devon Witherspoon who might not test that well lowers his stock just a little bit too. And all of a sudden now one of those guys who early on in the process we were talking about how great of a football player they are and how they might not be on the board for the Jaguars at 24 just because they're not going to – those aren't guys that are expected to run like a 4.3.
Right.
All of a sudden, next thing you know, oh, here it is. So those are guys that are like, okay, let's keep an eye on this because if they just run, pedestrian-looking numbers compared to some of these other guys that are going to be, 220 pounds, run a 4.4.
Right.
Who, athletic freaks, which is a good term. That's a compliment. But, so it'll be interesting what they do at 24. Just because they franchise tag Evan Engram, I don't think tight end's out of the question for the first round or the second round. Because, Evan is one type of tight end, and they could add a very different.
Right.
Michael Mayer would be a very different tight end. Washington out of Georgia, very different kind of tight end.
You've got one tight end on the roster.
And you've only got one. They don't have guys under contract. So, I think we'll learn a lot by what they do with Chris Manhertz if they do bring the veteran guy back. Because he is that other run-blocking kind of tight end. But could you upgrade his spot by bringing in a guy who can run block and give you a little bit more in the passing game? And in Philadelphia, Doug Peterson ran a whole lot of two tight end sets. But there's always a but. He didn't have quite the wide receiver room in Philadelphia that he has here in Jacksonville. Because now he's got Christian Kirk, who's paid starter money. Zay Jones paid starter money. And you've got Calvin Ridley, who's paid starter money. So you've got 3 guys that he wants to be on the field.
Right.
Plus, they'll probably add something there. Jamal Agnew has also showed that Doug Peterson knows how to design plays for him and get him on the field. So, not exactly the same wide receiver room that he was working with in Philadelphia, who was a bunch of guys, an older Alshon Jeffrey and other guys that, were hot and cold in the NFL. So it's a little bit of a different thing, but he still does have an affinity for tight ends.
That's cool. And I think to make a Doug Peterson offense hum and run fluidly like it needs to, you need those guys. Dan Arnold was not it. Chris Manhertz was not it. Luke Farrell was not it. You had Evan Engram and Evan Engram. That was it last year. So you need an additional tight end. I brought this up last time when we were talking about the mock drafts. Tight end, offensive tackle, defensive back, those 3 positions have been mocked to the Jaguars more than any other, and I'm talking heavily mocked the Jaguars more than any other. So tight end, and we've got some good ones. Luke Musgrave's a guy you mentioned as well this past week.
Yeah.
And again, he's more of that receiving threat, like an Evan Engram, an athlete kind of guy. So that's interesting. I think tight end is you got to go tight end in the first round, second round, something high, because regardless of bringing Evan Engram back, you still have a dearth.
Yeah,
There's nobody else on that roster right
Yeah.
now who could get in there and give Doug what he wants at that position.
Right, you just got to bring guys in unless they go and figure that out during free agency. Which, if I was looking at the free agent market right now and I'm Doug, I'm like, Irv Smith is very appealing because he's a former highly drafted guy who was productive at Alabama. I mean, I'm from New Orleans and he's from New Orleans. That's a whole nother conversation. But so I know what he did in high school. He was a very good player for Brother Martin there in New Orleans. But Irv is a high character guy who would fit in the locker room, and he's a guy who's had injuries, and that's one of the reasons why he maybe hasn't been as productive as he could have been while he was in Minnesota. He would fit almost the exact same bill of what they brought Evan Engram in on. So, like, if you brought in Irv Smith to come and be your tight end too, that would not be a bad move, because if you go back and look at Irv's numbers from the combine, dude's got some wheels too. So
it's always interesting. Combine is such a good time to kind of you look at the guys beforehand, their Senior Bowl stuff and tape from the season, and you get to the combine, and it's completely different. I mean, these guys train for the combine, trained to run there, trained to throw, to catch, and everything. Interesting to see how Trevor even talking in his second year before we saw him at a Gatorade event before the season started, and said so much different. Going into my second season in the league, so before my rookie year, I'm training to run, I'm training to throw. He was coming off surgery to his left shoulder. So I mean, it's so different for these guys. These draft prospects are training to be able to run, to be able to catch, to throw, everything, and then you get into a camp or everything. It's so different after your first season in the league, because again, you're trying to present yourself to your future wife. And look the best as you can, and then afterwards, year two, you can kind of be the guy on the couch and not dress as well and play video games all day. So it's different in year one to year two. So many good combine stories come out this time of year.
Yeah, and it's always fun looking at some of the stuff that's going on and some of the different guys. I wish we could have got up there to Indy maybe next year. But, the combine is definitely a fun time to see, and it shifts a lot around the draft as to what's going on and what might be on the table. And I think there's a lot of information that comes out during these weeks from guys that interview well to guys that don't interview as well. So there'll be some moving pieces. I think the Jaguars will be buyers on a tight end at some point in the draft. I almost guarantee that. It'll be interesting to see how they approach some of the other stuff. If sports betting was legal in Florida, maybe one day, I would put my money on the Jaguars using that first round pick on a defensive guy. Right now, I would put
defensive guy.
I would put my money on that defensive guy in the first round. That's just where I'm feeling it. I mean, if you look at Trent Baalke's track record, it says he's going to go a defensive guy. That's just what he's typically spent his high picks on. I think over 57% or something like that have been defensive guys. The majority of those defensive guys have been edge players. So if you say, okay, well, where does he lean?
Yeah.
Edge guys might make sense. And, it just depends on who's going to be on the board there at 24. That's going to be a big part of it, too. Because we can make a solid argument for Osiris Torrance, the guard out of Florida. I can make a really good argument for him to upgrade that offensive line.
Right.
It's Trevor Lawrence. No arguments over.
Of course.
That would make sense. We can make an argument for a tight end there. I mean, but I think defense is where you're going to go, because the defense, while they did come up with a bunch of turnovers, struggled.
Right.
They struggled at times.
You got to get pressure. To me, I like if DeJuan Smoot can come back. I would like that.
Yes.
For that depth
But
issue.
when is he going to be ready from the Achilles?
True.
Earliest point based on when he tore it. I mean, if you take James Robinson's timeline, we don't see him until like week 1-ish. I mean, he missed all the training camp and probably all the preseason. So it'd probably be like regular season almost. He'd probably start the year on the PUP list. Close to that.
But he's a guy that I did not think Jacksonville had any shot of bringing back this year, just with his career arc, and he's still young and producing a great season, and the injury happened. So I do think there's a chance Jacksonville can bring him back for that depth portion. Again, I'm with you. They need to do something on defense, whatever that is. They have got to find a way to get the quarterback more. So disappointing to have that much invested in that defensive front. And again, we'll get to the Roy Robertson Harris re-signing in a minute, but it's just so much invest in that defensive front. I mean, you've got a top 10 pick in Josh Allen going into his 5th year. You got a number 1 overall pick in Trayvon Walker. You've got Roy Robertson Harris, Follow Runso, I mean, on the line. And I mean, you've got so much invested in that line, you cannot generate more pressure than you did last year. And that was after taking 2 guys in the first round, 2 linebackers in the first round to get that pressure on. It just did not work. So I'm with you. I think they have to invest in finding a way to get that defensive pressure on the quarterback.
If they keep doing what they did late in the season, which they did 4 down in their nickel sets, which they're in most of the time. Trayvon Walker was the down in. They even slid him inside a few times. If the goal is to slide Trayvon inside on passing downs, B.J. Ojolari is my guy. High character from LSU, speed rusher around the outside. He'll probably be on the board at 24. He checks the boxes. Just throwing it out there right now. That's just where we go. All right, you mentioned Roy Robertson Harris. Yep. The Jaguars and Trent Baalke been very busy.
Been cooking cooking the books here.
Yeah, he's been getting to work. Roy Robertson Harris was one of the first guys. They gave him an extension. I know he had been a topic of conversation among Jags fans. A lot of people saying maybe he'd get cut or what they do to kind of alleviate that salary cap room. They handed Roy Robertson Harris an extension. He was big down the stretch and definitely very impactful. So it's good that he's going to stay in Jacksonville for a few more years. Along with that, they also reworked a few deals. Foye Oluokun, according to reports. Brandon Sheriff, Christian Kirk,
Zay Jones,
and
Jermichael Hasty.
And Jermichael Hasty is an extension.
Right.
So they re-signed him because he was going to be a restricted free agent. The other guys, they restructured their contracts. Now, if you don't know what that means, basically they took some of the money that would have been on the books, turned it into a signing bonus, and they give that to them up front, so that way they still get their money. It's just not on the salary cap book. So that lowers their cap number, and they get their money now. Now, the one thing that I want to point out about that is that's Shad Khan, because you have to have an owner that's willing to write a check in order to do that. So I know a lot of people can be critical of Shad's involvement with the team or the wins that they've had underneath Shad Khan. Trent Baalke's not able to restructure these deals and create salary cap room if Shad Khan doesn't tell him, here's the checkbook, go write the checks and get the job done. Which there are some owners around the NFL that are not willing to cut those sorts of deals. And that's why it is important that they have an owner like Shad Khan who basically told Trent, hey, look, go do what you got to do. The checkbook's right here. Just do what you got to do.
Of course.
So he's able to do that. So they're just moving the money around. It's not a question of how much these guys are getting paid. It's just when
they're getting paid. Yeah. That's Trent Baalke said at his last availability before the combine. He said, the salary cap can be manipulated in a lot of ways, and the more important than the cap and restructuring is available cash that you can put your money on and hand to a player, and not the cap. Cap can be maneuvered, navigated. Christian Kirk, he's still getting all of his money. Jacksonville saved $26 million on the cap with its restructures and its deals. It's not like those guys are taking a discount.
No.
They're just paying Christian Kirk. If he was going to get paid the first week of April, he gets paid the last week of March, something like that, to where it's just accounting creativity. But Jacksonville, these moves have been significant because starting the offseason, they were $30 million plus over the salary cap of 2023. So by the start of that new league year on March 15th, Jacksonville has to be under that cap, which they are now. And I still think some more maneuvers are going to come there.
They were under. That Evan deal, or the franchise tag is going to move them pretty close. They'll still be under, though. The one thing that's floating out there, Shaquille Griffin.
Right.
He's not playing on that contract. Now, whether you want to say, they're going to work out something with him and keep him in Jacksonville or cut him, those are two different conversations. But he will not play on the cap number that he is currently owed. There's no way.
He is at a $17.147 million deal right now.
He's the second biggest cap hit on the Jaguars roster currently. He is not playing on that number. Whether it's a restructure to keep him in here in Jacksonville, whether he's cut, that number has to change. And I think they're kind of holding on to that one, and they may have already figured out what they're going to do with Shaq because Calvin Ridley's numbers aren't on the books yet. So you can almost consider that like a pin. Let's just put a pin in that because they know whatever they're going to do with Shaq is probably going to coincide with all right, it's time to put Calvin Ridley's contract under the salary cap. Okay, Shaq, either sign this restructure or you're gone, and then Calvin Ridley comes in. So there's something that one's definitely going to change. That's got to. There's no choice.
Got to. There's no. I mean, and that was even right before Shaq was put on IR last year. You knew. Looking at his number and where things were headed, he was not going to be back on a $17.1 million cap hit. And you've seen the numbers going down on the cap. I mean, Fadakasi, Darius Williams, those guys are at 12.5 or 12.7, 12.5 million. Maybe a restructure here or there for those guys. Christian Kirk's already been navigated down there. He's at 11.4 cap hit right now. So a lot of these restructures and stuff, people are confused by that. Trent said it's not. Restructuring is not a big issue because these guys are still getting paid.
Yes.
It's just in the form of where they're getting paid. So
it's creative financing, and nobody ever explains it normally. Yeah. Normally they just say, "Oh, this deal's been restructured," and people are like, "What does that mean?"
It's not like that people are thinking that, and I think it's been mentioned before that these guys are taking discounts or, giving money back or something like that.
And some guys do end up taking discounts. Right. Like some of the stuff, some of the creative finance that goes on with like adding void years and stuff like that, sometimes that can be creating a discount, but in this case it's not.
No.
Like there are times where those void years inflate the contract numbers, but that's a whole different thing that the Jaguars haven't done. The one last thing we got to talk about before we wrap this up is that report card from the NFLPA.
Oof.
We can't not talk about that.
Bad.
So the NFLPA for the first time put out a report card before free agency. They said players have basically been asking them to put out a free agency guide that kind of tells you, hey, if you go and sign with the Green Bay Packers or the Jacksonville Jaguars, what will life kind of be like there? Because you don't know. It's like going to a new company. You don't really know what the day-to-day life is, what the infrastructure is like until you get there.
A very good handbook is what this basically was for guys to look at their prospective new future homes and say, hey, okay, this is the food here is good. The workout rooms are bad. So it's more of a guidebook, a style book for these players and their agents to look at.
Jaguars finished 28th out of 32, so not good. The strength coaches did get an A, so hand claps to the Jaguars strength coaches there. But the two big things that players complained about, the NFLPA said the unanimous answer from players was get rid of the rats in the locker room. Apparently there was a rat problem in the locker room for a few weeks, and it was all in the laundry baskets and stuff. Now, I did say that the rat problem at TIA Bank Field is documented. I mean, there were the health inspector reports from last season that came out. And they were in the building, and it was mentioned in that health inspection. So that is what it is. The other one that was big was the treatment of families, because they said they got reports from players that because there's no family room, that players' wives were breastfeeding, sitting on the floor of public bathrooms and things of that nature because they don't have a family room right now. So while it looks bad on the surface, and it does,
the headlines are terrible.
The headlines are terrible. The one part that people haven't been talking about enough is the little caveat that you can kind of cling to for hope. Well, there's two. One, they're building a practice facility, so they will be out of the bank and in a new building. And if they're building a state-of-the-art new building and it has rats, then I don't know who they hired to build it and what went wrong. But number two is that they said that the players on the team, over 90% of the ones that they surveyed said they had confidence in Shad Khan to fix the problems, which means that they believe that some of the stuff was just an incident that Shad maybe didn't know about or an oversight, and they believe that Shad was going to take care of said situations.
There's been good progress made, and I think that was a footnote in that. Anytime you hear rats and hampers and running free and no place for breastfeeding mothers to have time with their baby except on a bathroom floor. I mean, those are egregious faults for a multi-billion dollar company in the Jaguars. But again, these are issues that are being addressed. Again, new Miller Electric facility coming along, a new stadium or renovated stadium will be coming along in the future at some point. So these are things that are being taken to address, but not good headlines at all.
No, the headlines look terrible. And you know what? We'll talk about maybe some stadium issues a little bit further on into the offseason, because I know there was a survey that came out this week about, people's willingness to help with the stadium or not help with the stadium. So I think that's definitely a conversation that has to be had, because the Jaguars are looking to do something with TIAA Bank Field in the near future. So what that looks like,
Yeah.
we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Right now we're focused on draft and free agency and a lot of moving parts, but it should be an exciting offseason, even though Jaguars aren't going to be big players in free agency. That should keep everybody kind of like clinging to hope of, who could they land? You're not going to get that big splash first day guy. I mean, unless they're re-signing one of their own guys. Like maybe you see them say, we got our deal with Evan, or we got Arden Key coming back kind of deal, but probably not very many other players early on.
No, I think these are going to be spot filler kind of guys. Fillers.
Yeah, and then you'll probably get more reports of deals being restructured to create some more space along those lines. But I think that'll probably about do it for us on this News4JAGs podcast. Thanks for tuning in. You can always check us out over on News4JAGs.com and in the News4JAGs Plus app, and we'll see you next time.